Hi, welcome to a special virtual presentation of the 2021 London Swine Conference. I'm Teresa Van Ray, your LSC chair and a very proud pork producer from Huron County. Last year, we marked our 20th conference. Since 2001, the London Swine Conference has helped connect producers, researchers, industry, and policymakers across our pork sector. It's an important opportunity to share science-based information that helps each of us do our part to make our businesses and industry stronger. So we all know that chatting with each other face to face and having that cup of Java, the odd glass of hops, or fermented grapes, my favorite, it's such a huge part of learning from each other and, well, a lot of fun. Remember, fun? Not sure about you, but I've not exactly felt in control of a lot in my life lately. However, knowledge is power. Knowledge can help us gain back some of the control we all need to have success. While we aren't able to gather this year in person, we are excited to bring you a series of live and on-demand presentations from people at the top of their fields. We are one of the many phenomenal industries that have continued to produce food for the world throughout this past year. For that, thanks to each and every one of you and your families. So, sit back. We invite you to enjoy this virtual presentation. And I, for one, look so forward to seeing each and every one of you face to face and celebrating with you in 2022.
Welcome to the London Swine Conference video series. My name is Stacey Ash, and I'm the Manager of Communications and Consumer Marketing with Ontario Pork. On behalf of the London Swine Conference, I'd like to acknowledge the support of our premier sponsors, Better Pork, Farm Credit Canada, and Total Swine Genetics. Joining us is Mike Van Massow with his presentation, Consumer Trends in Protein Markets, Impacts of a Pandemic and Beyond. Mike Van Massow is an associate professor in the Department of Food, Agriculture, and Resource Economics at the University of Guelph, and the OAC Chair in Food System Leadership. His research focuses on understanding how people make food choices and the development of value chains to support those choices. Check out his food-focused blog and podcast for current discussions of issues and trends relative to food from farm to fork. With that, I'd like to pass it over to Dr. Van Massow.
Well, thanks, Stacey. I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to the group. I wish we were all here in London in person, but under the circumstances, we'll make the best of the situation. And I appreciate the opportunity to have a few minutes to talk about what's happening in the protein market. So I'm going to share my screen so that we can see the presentation, and here we go. So. As Stacey said, my name is Mike Van Massow. I'm at the University of Guelph, and I do a lot of work in how people think about food, how people make food decisions, and how we get food to the people that meets their needs. And so I've been asked to talk a little bit about what's happening in protein markets. And before we do that, I think I'd like to take a step back and talk a little bit about some context of where we are, and notably, what do consumers know about food production? I'm not going to spend a pile of time here, but I think it's worth contextualizing this from the perspective of producers to say, why are we don't always understand exactly why people are making the decisions they make, and what we can do to shape those decisions going forward. So I think the first thing we need to talk about is that consumers generally feel pretty good about the food system, and they feel especially good about farmers. And while we had some glitches almost exactly a year ago when we had some shortages in stores, those were really quite short term. And if you look at the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity's tracking, people feel better about the food system than they did even beforehand. So I think the sort of bend but didn't break experience we had actually reassured people. So I would argue that the issue is not trust. The issue is really a lack of understanding how food is produced. And then you have a gap between they feel pretty good, but they have no idea what you're doing. And then when they learn about something, they become surprised. And so I will argue at several points here when we're talking about trends that we need to engage with consumers and talk what we're doing. I know the focus today is on pork, but I think there is a lesson to be learned in the recent experience about butter, where people found out that small amounts of palmitic acid were being fed to dairy cows, and they said, "What? That's not something we understood well. That's not something we expected." And rather than having talked about it beforehand, we had to engage at moments of crisis. And the truth is, we may yet lose that ingredient, although I think probably we'll be able to manage it. So helping people understand will allow us to get beyond trust to what I call a social contract, where we really sort of engage and talk about production practices with consumers so that they understand and we understand where they're coming from, that there may be moments where consumers say, "No, we're not really 100% comfortable with that," but it's much better to do that in a proactive way. And I think, as I said, that really creates an imperative for action. So, consumers really don't understand. We ask consumers raised for meat are slaughtered at the age of 4. We all know that to be false. More than 50% of people said, "I have no idea." Almost 40% said they disagree, and I would argue that some of them are guessing. So that says, they really don't have a good sense of how food is produced. Responses to a dairy cow gives milk only after calving. That's basic mammalian biology. Again, we had 40% of people who said, "I don't know," 30% who agreed, and almost 30% who disagreed. And again, I think some of these are probably guessing. So even if this 30% is accurate, that's pretty low. And then we're going to have a nuanced discussion about feeding practices, about feed ingredients, about housing, and those sorts of things. We have to realize that we're coming from a place of not much information. The other thing I think is worth seeing is how some of these things are evolving. So this graph is from 2015, where we asked people, what are your current perceptions about welfare in animal welfare on farms in Canada? And I think we had, this is roughly 25% of people who said, "I don't think it's very good." There's about a third who were honest and said, "I really have no idea." And there was this group who said, "Really, we don't think it's too bad." And if we look, this is in 2019, we've actually moved people a little bit more positive. So again, people feel pretty good. Again, that means they probably don't know what we're doing, but I think to a large degree, we have a very good story to tell. And I think that this is important in the context of trends in protein, because welfare is one of the things that get people sort of a little uptight and maybe have them thinking about going in other directions. So we're actually on welfare, we're moving in the right direction. And just to give you some context, this is what it looks like for antibiotics right now. So here we have probably closer to 30% who are saying, "Yeah, I'm not real comfortable with antibiotic use on farms." And I think the discussions we're having now and some of the commitments we're making now will help move that to the right. And so I think we need to have those conversations. Some research we've done says that when we say, "This is why we're using them, this is how we're using them, these products are approved, they're used therapeutically under the guidance of a veterinarian," we close that gap significantly to products that are raised without antibiotics. So I think, again, that provides a real impetus for us to be having a proactive conversation to sort of affect the trends in protein markets that we're seeing. But, I think we have to think about how we talk to people. And this one is in laying hens, but my experience is it's very similar for swine. We ask people, do these things improve animal well-being, reduce animal well-being, does not affect animal well-being, and don't know. And the truth is that this don't know should probably be up here. But you know, we say larger space per hen. Well, space sounds good, so I'm going to say that's good, even though I really don't know how much space they're getting anyway. Nest boxes. You know, 2/3 of people said nest boxes are positive, but no one has any idea what a nest box is, right? So those words feel warm and fuzzy. And, you know, perches for roosting. But then we get down here to antibiotics, and almost 40% of people say those things are bad for an animal's well-being. That's fundamentally why we're using antibiotics. And so we have to realize that in some cases, the words matter, the words that people are thinking about, the words that people are hearing are affecting their perception. And again, that really says that we need to engage them. And so this is well-being. This is the same graph with the same questions for impacts on the environment. And so again, we have some things that we say are really, you know, we had almost 1/3 of people who say more space is actually good for the environment. Well, you know, it takes more energy, all of those sorts of things. I would say it's probably indifferent, but if anything, it's a little worse. But again, here we look at antibiotics, and again, almost 40% of people said giving laying hens antibiotics is bad for the environment. So my suggestion here is that when we talk about antibiotics, no matter what we ask them, they'll say it's bad. And again, we have to understand that those are the perceptions. I'm not saying, God, we got to give it up. What I'm saying is we have to engage them and help them understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. So let's start talking again, rather than specifically at the protein market, let's talk a little bit first about the wider changes in consumer behavior. And the first one I think that we need to talk about is there is no the consumer, and I know I've used that term already a couple of times. We've got this real dispersion in consumer markets where there's a move away from commodity markets, and consumers are looking for specific attributes in the products that they're buying. And this is really, I think, accelerating as consumers learn more about agriculture, that people have different preferences as to production practices and those sorts of things. And so we are going to continue to see more dispersion in demand, and our ability to meet that dispersion will affect our success in the future. And I want to highlight here that this is not about wanting more choices. This is about different people wanting different things. And this is a real challenge, not only for producers and processors, this is a real challenge for retailers as well, is striking a balance between choice and overwhelming consumers so that they can't find what they want. What I mean is that I don't want a choice between 16 different types of eggs or 30 different types of mustard. It's just that I want a different kind of mustard than you want, than someone else wants, than someone else wants. And stores have to balance providing access to that choice to give as many different consumers, to get as many different consumers as they can into the door, and making it so I can still find. And I think we'll start to see some structural change in grocery stores. As you know, stores have historically tried to get people to walk through the whole store. Their success is getting a bigger basket because margins are relatively low. But I think we'll start to see sort of a focus on consumers rather than products in stores, so that I'll know exactly where to go to find my stuff. And you'll see it already in some large grocery stores where they have an ethnic food section and they have a healthy food section where you can buy some of the products or similar products than you would find in the specific aisle. So I think that that's something that we really need to keep our eyes on, and has real potential impact on the demand for proteins. I think this is reiterated here. This is some research we did a couple of years ago where we give people 100 points and say, how important is each factor when you choose a restaurant? And I'll argue later that restaurants really lead our demand. And so that's one of the reasons I thought this was worth putting in here. And so they get 100 points. So clearly price and taste matter. They dominate. They're table stakes. You're not going to go to a restaurant unless you think it's priced fairly and that you like it. But this, brand is relatively low, and then there's healthy meal option, animal welfare, producer welfare, environment, employee welfare, that they treat their employees well. And this doesn't mean that you have to do all of them, although you'll find many places are trying to do all of them because different things matter to different consumers. For some people, they're going there because there's a healthy meal option. For some people, they're going there because of a commitment to animal welfare. Some people are going there because of an environmental commitment. And this is really a reflection of that dispersion at the consumer level. So what does that mean in terms of differences in production? The first thing is production. We'll have, and we're seeing this already. We're seeing raised without and conventional. We're seeing location becoming an issue. We're seeing people brand based on Canadian or sometimes even Ontario for some products, and that's becoming important to some consumers. Organic is one. Channel is becoming important too. It's amazing how many meat processors I'm talking to now, especially smaller ones, who are working on a direct channel to consumers. While my mother, who passed away a year ago, was one of these retired ladies in her 80s who would go to 3 different grocery stores because the opportunity cost of her time was relatively low, and she would go buy exactly what she wanted at different stores. For me, that wasn't really an option because I don't have the time to go to 3 different stores. 2 in Fergus Elora where I live, 1 in KW, which is a specialty store. I just can't do that. But it is relatively easy for me to switch from, say, a mainstream retailer's website to another website to order something specific that I want. And the delivery infrastructure has gotten so much better in the last year in the context of the pandemic that I think we're going to see many of these smaller processors expand their access to the market by going direct or going into these box programs that are local. And that means that we are selling products with different attributes, products where we can tell that story, and products where we can stabilize the demand for our products. So I think channel is becoming more and more important. And people say, well, yeah, people still like to go to the butcher or go to the counter or even to the meat counter and see exactly what they're buying. I think that's true to a large extent. But what I'm saying is this is giving an opportunity, and we're seeing growth in that opportunity. I've ordered directly from a friend of mine who's a small meat producer, and it was a really good experience. My wife still prefers to go to the actual grocery store, but I've ordered from an online grocer, not one that picks from the store, but one that delivers out of a warehouse. And they sit in my driveway and they take a temperature of the freezer stuff, of the cold refrigerator stuff, to ensure that the cold chain has been maintained. This can work, and it will work, and it will provide an opportunity to give consumers greater choice, not only in what they buy, but how they buy. I talked a little bit about product attributes, how it's raised without, those sorts of things. And I think there are going to be new products that continue to give consumers a range of choice. One of the things that I think is important to understand is that and I'll talk about this in a couple of minutes, is that people are buying a wider portfolio of products. And it doesn't necessarily mean they dislike your product because they're eating it less. It just means they've got all this choice and they take advantage of that choice. And I think that's an important distinction, and it becomes an important thing to think about as we think about how to maintain a share of that consumer's wallet. So I think that means there'll be more difference between producers. We've hesitated to do that in the past. We've sort of said, well, being different means we're criticizing the old way. And I don't think that that's necessarily the case. What it means is we are producing products for specific segments of the market. One is not better than the other. We are meeting the demands of consumers. You know, when Henry Ford introduced the Model T, he said you could have whatever color you wanted as long as it was black, because he was the only game in town. Now there are tons of car companies, and no one would think to say that every car company should make exactly the same car, and even that each car company should only make one kind of car and not provide the consumer's choice. I think that we need to look at production in all segments of agriculture and say, are there ways that we can either grow or keep our business by meeting the specific needs of that consumer? That means there'll be changes in the value chain. I've talked about going direct and those sorts of things, but it also means that we are changing the relationships between the players in the value chain. And I would argue that in some cases, what we're doing, what's called anchoring that value chain, so that there is more of a relationship. I was speaking some time ago to a potato producer who is a former student of mine, who bags organic potatoes and sells them to a large retailer in the US. That retailer said, "We love your potatoes. We'd like to put them in our bag." And he phoned me up and said, "Mike, should I do that?" And I said, "Well, if they're a big customer and they say you have to, then you don't have a lot of choice. But if you have a choice, I'd leave it in your bags, because then the customer knows this is what they expect. That's attached to your brand. It anchors, frankly, that value chain on your farm, because if they put organic potatoes in that retailer's bag, then if someone else comes with organic potatoes, even from China or wherever, for a couple of pennies cheaper, they can put them in that bag and it's not attached to you." So I think we'll really see some changes, which means changes not only at the production level, but throughout the value chain. And we're starting to see those things. We're starting to see them with A&W's move towards grass-fed beef, and now they're putting the farmers who produce that beef in their commercials, and so that really says that we have built this relationship from start to finish, and I think that that's only going to become more common. Now, that's sort of the big picture trends. Let's talk about some more sort of protein specific trends. And one we're hearing more and more about is lab grown proteins. We have the technology to synthesize casein and whey from yeast. So, it won't be long before we have some dairy products that will have come from casein and whey fermented in a fermenter. We're lab grown meat. I read something the other day that you can now, for $23, get a plate of lab grown chicken nuggets in Singapore. So that price point is coming down. I apologize to the pork people for my cow-based pun, but I think this is true for all markets. Is this apocalypse cow? No. But I think there is some disruption. I don't think that this will, notwithstanding what Bill Gates is saying, I don't think this will replace conventional proteins. It will be just another choice. It won't work for everyone. I'm not a big fan of chicken nuggets. Frankly, I like red meat better. But until they can give me a muscle cut and the texture and the mouth feel, I think I'm going to stick with traditional meat, and I think that there are lots of consumers that are saying the same thing. Now, it could create some challenges around around carcass management, right? So if there are some products that are seeing either plant-based or lab-grown options come in, that might mean that there's still some really popular cuts and some less popular cuts, and the relative pricing will be interesting for processes. But I don't think it is the end of protein anytime soon. In fact, I think that protein will continue to be, or sort of conventional protein will continue to be sort of the core part of protein consumption. But there are going to be some options, and that will, or there'll be some sort of sharing of the market, and that will cause some disruption. It will probably also affect how we communicate about our products to those customers, where we talk about tradition, you know, the Sunday roast, the pork chop dinner, those sorts of things that we really feel good about, and that to a degree we not only talk about the attributes of our product, but we talk about those traditions and the feelings, you know, ham on Easter, and those sorts of things become increasingly important. So alternate proteins are going to become more important. Plant-based and lab-grown proteins are playing a bigger role. Almost 50% of Canadians say they're increasing plant-based protein, sort of this flexitarianism. They still like red meat. It becomes a question of which red meats they're eating, right? So that carcass management, I think, becomes important. But these people, the 50% of Canadians, or frankly, I think that number is probably a little higher now, who say they are diversifying their protein diets, will have a bigger impact on demand for traditional proteins than the vegans and the vegetarians will. And we'll have to think about how to maintain our share with those people. And they're doing it for many reasons. Some of it's cost, some of it's health, some of it's environment, some of it's got to do with the animals' welfare and antibiotics. And so we need to come up with responses to those concerns. Welfare tends to become an absolute. You can't say, well, we're mistreating a smaller number of animals. That becomes harder to rationalize. But the environment one, you can say, well, I'm reducing my impact by eating lentils once a week or something like that. So thinking about the motivation there becomes critically important. Antibiotic use, I talked a little bit about. There's increasing awareness without good understanding. You know, it's true that there is a mechanism of resistance development. We have to talk about the trade-offs for animal welfare. There are some real misconceptions. It's surprising how many people think that there are antibiotics in the meat, and that's why there's resistance, and that's why there are problems for them. So I think, again, this is a concern. It is an increasing concern, but we have evidence to suggest we can mitigate that concern if we proactively engage with these consumers. And I really see the industry taking a leading role in this regard and really doing some good things. Gene editing is going to be, I think, one of the next big issues that we see. It's different than genetic engineering, so it's not transgenic products, but it allows us to sort of customize either for production efficiency or for animal health or for even consumer benefits, these animals, and it remains to be seen how consumers will respond. We're doing a ton of work in this area right now, trying to understand it better. But this technology is becoming increasingly easier to implement, and we'll have to see whether we can create value using it or if consumers are going to back away. But I think that one's going to be important. Notwithstanding the last year where we've seen significant disruption in the restaurant market, restaurants are becoming more and more important, and I think they will bounce back after we get out of this pandemic. Before the pandemic, we spent almost 40% of our food dollar in restaurants. In the US, that was up over 50%. Restaurants communicate directly to us. They make choices for us. And what I mean when I say they make choices for us is is, you feel like you have choice when you go to a restaurant because they have a menu, and you get to choose which product on the menu you want. But the truth is that they've made a bunch of choices in forming that menu. You have much less choice than you do in the retail store, and then you do at home. And I mean, if you look at cage-free eggs or crate-free pork, driven to a significant degree by commitments made at restaurants who make those choices for us and then create the critical mass of demand. So and because they communicate about those choices, they really, to a significant degree, shape our perceptions beyond the restaurant. I showed you that information on the evolution of attitudes about animal welfare in a positive sense. I would argue that to a significant degree, that's been driven by restaurants making commitments, saying, look, we're making things better, and people feel better about it. So while many of us, or less me, many of you might grumble at restaurants and these commitments, I would argue they're doing they are doing the industry a service by improving confidence. Then there comes the question of sustainability. I'm not going to spend a ton of time. I think I'm running close to the end of my time. I think there's a real concern about environmental impact. There's really difficult to define what sustainability is, and because each customer has a different definition of sustainability, I think this helps drive some of that dispersion in demand. It's poorly understood. It's driving to a degree the move to plant-based proteins. I think we're going to see increased claims relative to soil health. It's amazing to me how many consumers, again, probably to a degree with a very shallow knowledge, are talking about soil health and carbon. I think food waste is becoming increasingly important, and it becomes about telling our story. So I think, again, to a significant degree, with some of the things we've already implemented, we've got a very good story to tell, but some of these things may drive further changes in practices. I spoke about the fact that I didn't think that vegetarians and vegans were driving that much about it. We've done surveys. About 8% of respondents said they were vegetarian or vegan. I think that probably overstates the actual. I think there's some evidence that there's significant attrition for people who become vegan and then decide to go back. And I think this survey, and I don't want to diminish, I think people have every right to make their choices. I make different choices. But what I wanted to highlight here is we didn't look to trick people with this survey. We asked earlier for a different part of research how often people eat a main meal with no animal protein, and then we asked them later whether they were a vegan or a vegetarian. And if you look here, we had vegans. More than 20% of vegans say they eat a main meal with no animal protein 2 to 4 times a week. That suggests they are actually eating a little bit and maybe are sort of either aspirational vegans and are more a flexitarian who are eating more choice, or there's some virtue signaling going on here and say, well, I should be a vegan, but I'm not. And so that reinforces that this is probably a bit overstated. That's not to say those aren't going to have an impact on demand for proteins, but I think what it says is that this mass in the middle, the flexitarians that are diversifying their portfolio of proteins. I mean, my 25-year-old son who lives in Toronto is an example of this. He loves meat and he eats a lot of meat, but he also will buy some Beyond Meat and cook with that as well, and just for variety and cost and those sorts of things. And those are the people I think that we really need to think about and talk about as we work through communicating about what we're doing. And so to wrap up, there's significant change coming. Many of these changes present opportunities for Ontario agriculture, Ontario pork producers. I think that there are real opportunities here to engage and add value for consumers. I think agriculture has a very good story to tell. We don't only tell it; we need to listen. That's the conversation. And we need to be at the table for that conversation, because it's going to happen whether we are there or not. So, are there changes coming? Yes. Are there some of them that will be disruptive to the protein markets? Yes. Is there an opportunity to engage consumers and really reinforce the reason they like our products and to produce products that will serve them? Yes, yes, and yes. And I think if we don't participate in that conversation, it will happen regardless. So that's what I wanted to say today. I'll close with a little bit of shameless self-promotion. Thank you very much for the opportunity. If you have questions, that's my email address. You can email me at the university. I tweet about food all the time. That's my Twitter handle. And I have a blog and a podcast that we talk about issues around food and protein on a regular basis. And you might find some of it interesting. So that wraps up what I wanted to do today, and say thank you for the opportunity.
Mike, thank you so much for your insights today. As we hopefully can see the light at the end of the tunnel to the global pandemic that's affected us for the last several months. Really helpful to understand consumer patterns, not just today, but for the foreseeable future. And I think for myself and the work that I do, but also for people across the industry, it's so helpful. The better we understand consumer expectations and behavior, the better we can identify those opportunities to grow and change and make meaningful improvements. The London Swine Conference Committee would like to thank everyone for taking part in this virtual event. And we thank the sponsors that have made this possible. You've seen their logos on screen as you were watching. They're Hipra Animal Health, Kemin, KenPal, New Life Mills, Wallenstein Feed and Supplies, and Zoetis. Please show them your appreciation when you have the opportunity. On behalf of the committee, we hope you are doing well in these uncertain times, and we truly hope to see you in person for LSC 2022.